What would you do if you heard your future daughter-in-law call you the embarrassing relative at your own son's engagement dinner? How do you stay calm when a room full of glossy strangers laughs at you like you are a joke, while your own son squeezes your arm and says, "Relax, Dad. Tomorrow is our turn"? Can a quiet father, who everyone thinks is simple and poor, really turn the tables in one day without shouting, fighting, or breaking the law? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Gerald Cole, and the night my son got engaged was the first time in my life I truly understood what it meant to be standing in a room full of people and still feel completely invisible. I ironed my one good shirt 3 times that afternoon, pressing each sleeve until the fabric looked as smooth as I could make it, even though the cuffs were a little frayed and the collar had lost its stiffness years ago. I polished my old leather shoes until they shone in the yellow light of my small kitchen, then stood in front of the mirror over the sink and tried to see myself the way other people might see me. A man in his early 60s, hair more gray than brown, shoulders still straight from years of lifting boxes and climbing in and out of trucks, face lined from sun and worry and too many late nights at the warehouse. I did not look rich, important, or impressive. I knew that, but I thought I looked neat, respectable, and like someone who was proud to show up for his son. That was enough for me, or at least I wanted it to be enough. The restaurant Nathan and Lila had chosen for their engagement dinner was downtown, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a valet stand out front where young men in black jackets ran to collect keys from people who never had to worry about parking tickets. When my bus dropped me a block away, I walked the last few minutes in the cold winter air, my breath puffing white in front of me, clutching a small gift bag with a simple framed photo inside of Nathan as a kid, holding up his first school certificate. It felt like a silly little present next to whatever luxury items Lila's friends would bring, but it was what I could afford and what I thought might mean something to my son. As I approached the restaurant, I watched luxury cars glide up to the entrance, engines humming softly, their headlights reflecting off the glass. Women stepped out in fitted dresses and high heels, men in sharp suits with shiny watches on their wrists. I saw myself in the reflection, coat a little too big, scarf knitted by my late wife years ago, and I felt that old familiar pinch in my chest that came whenever I stepped into spaces that were built for appearances more than people. I told myself that this night was not about me. It was about Nathan and his happiness, about showing him I supported his choice, even if I did not fully understand Lila's world. At the host stand, I gave my son's name. The young man behind the podium gave me a quick glance, his eyes skating over my clothes in that way that says he has already decided what kind of tip I will not be leaving. He led me through the main dining area, past tables where couples laughed over plates arranged like tiny art pieces, and opened a frosted glass door into the private room booked for the engagement dinner. The room was bright and stylish, with a long table laid out under hanging lights shaped like golden rings, and a wall of glass showing the city lights outside. At the far end of the room, I saw Nathan in a navy suit, tie slightly loosened, talking with a small group of people. His face lit up when he saw me, and he stepped away from them, walking toward me with that same slightly hurried stride he had as a teenager when he came home late from basketball practice. He hugged me in a quick, firm way and told me he was glad I made it, that I looked good. I thanked him and tried to ignore the way my ears burned from embarrassment and pride mixing together. While he guided me further into the room, my eyes moved across Lila and her friends gathered by the bar, crystal glasses in hand, their laughter sharp and bright like little glass shards. Lila wore a pale dress that shimmered when she moved, her hair styled in soft waves over her shoulders, her lips painted the color of ripe berries. She was beautiful, I could not deny that, and in that moment, part of me understood why my son had fallen so hard. She did not see me at first. She was turned slightly away, one hand brushing her hair back as she spoke to 2 women in red lipstick and glittering earrings. I was close enough to hear her words, even though she was speaking in a low, playful tone. She said she hoped her fiancé's dad would not do that thing where he tells long truck stories, because she did not want clients thinking they had some embarrassing relative from a completely different world. One of her friends laughed and asked if he was the one she had mentioned who still wore that tragic old man watch. Lila giggled and said yes, and added that it was fine because every family has that one embarrassing relative who means well, and that she just hoped he would not sit too close to the important guests. The words slid into my ears so calmly that at first I thought maybe I had misheard her. Then Nathan's hand tightened just slightly on my arm, and I knew I had not. I stood there, feeling the heat rise in my face and neck, grateful and ashamed at the same time that Lila's back was still turned. In a strange way, it would have almost been easier if she had said it straight to my face. Hearing it from behind, while she smiled and performed for her friends, made me feel more like a piece of furniture than a person. One of the women glanced past Lila's shoulder and saw me standing there with my small gift bag and my old coat. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then slid away, like she was nudging herself to keep playing along. That tiny pause told me she had understood exactly who I was. Lila finally turned, surprise flickering across her face for a heartbeat before she slipped on a bright, practiced smile. She walked over, kissed my cheek quickly in the air, and said she was so happy I could come. The words sounded like something she had memorized from a script. She did not mention what I had just heard, and I did not mention it either. I just held out the gift bag with the photo frame inside and told her I had brought a small memory from Nathan's childhood. She took it with fingers that barely curled around the handles and passed it off to a nearby chair without even peeking inside, telling me we would look at everything later. Cynthia and Douglas, her parents, approached soon after. Cynthia wore a dress that probably cost more than my car, and her perfume hung in the air like a soft cloud. She smiled in a practiced way and said I looked very comfortable, then joked lightly that she wished her own father had been as relaxed about clothing at big events because she had been raised in a very strict, formal house. Douglas shook my hand with a firm grip and asked how retirement was treating me, his tone polite but distant. When I said I still did some consulting and kept an eye on the company, he nodded in a way that made it clear he did not take those words seriously. He asked if I was enjoying stepping back and letting Nathan take charge of the big decisions. I answered that Nathan had always been capable and that I trusted him. The conversation moved on quickly, away from me toward wedding venues and potential guest lists. I sat down at the long table near the end, not at the head, but not quite at the kid's side either, the place where you put someone you are not sure how to frame. Lila's friends and a few colleagues from her marketing firm filled the seats near the center, all glossy hair and shining screens, taking little videos of the dessert cart, and joking about who would post which moment first. Sophie, the event manager, stepped in and out of the room, checking place cards, adjusting candles, and making sure the service moved smoothly. Once, as she passed behind my chair, she gave me a small, kind smile, the kind you give someone when you can sense they do not quite belong to the scene around them. It did not fix anything, but I held onto it like a small handrail in a moving train. As the dinner went on, people made small speeches. Cynthia stood and praised her daughter's beauty and ambition, saying how proud she was that Lila was finally aligning with a family that matched her drive. She mentioned Nathan's bright future and thanked Douglas for advising on the business side of things. She nodded toward me like you nod toward a quiet painting on the wall and said she was sure I was very proud. Lila's friends raised their glasses and joked about how brandable this couple was, how perfect they would look in engagement photos in front of certain hotels and landmarks. One of them asked loudly whether Nathan's family business had a social media presence yet, because old companies need new faces. The words were said with a laugh, but it was clear who they imagined as old. I watched Nathan through all of this. He smiled, he nodded, he thanked people, but every now and then his jaw tightened, or his eyes flicked toward me for a brief second before he looked away again. When the main course ended and dessert plates were set down, I felt like my role in the evening had been completed. I had shown up on time, behaved, smiled when people took group photos, and let their comments roll past me like light rain. The heaviness in my chest, though, had grown into something almost physical. During a small break between speeches, I pushed back my chair quietly and stood, planning to slip out to the restroom, maybe even tell the host I was leaving a little early. No one would miss me, I told myself. They had their photos, their toasts, their plans. I moved toward the door, my hand already reaching for the handle. The noise of the room blurred behind me, laughter and music blending into a distant hum. Before I could step through the doorway, I felt a hand wrap gently around my forearm. I turned and saw Nathan standing there, face closer to mine than it had been all evening, his eyes steady and more serious than they had looked all night. He asked in a low voice where I was going. I told him I did not want to be in the way, that his future in-laws and friends seemed to be having a good time, and that I was tired. He shook his head, just once, and leaned in so only I could hear him over the clatter of plates and the buzz of conversation. He told me to relax, that he knew what they had been saying, that he had heard worse from them when they thought he was not listening. Then he squeezed my arm a little tighter and whispered, almost calmly, that tonight was their show, but tomorrow would be our turn. For a second, I did not understand what he meant. The words sat in my mind like a puzzle piece that almost fit, but not yet. Then I saw him pull his phone from his pocket, tap the screen, and show me a calendar reminder he had just created for the next morning with a name I recognized all too well, the lawyer who had helped set up my first company papers. My feet stopped moving. The door stayed closed behind me. In that narrow space between the bright room and the exit, my son's quiet voice and that small glowing square of text made me realize that for the first time in a long time, I was not the only one in the family who had decided that being treated as the embarrassing relative had gone far enough. On the bus ride home that night, the city lights blurred past the window, and I kept hearing that little phrase in my head, like a song stuck on repeat. The embarrassing relative. By the time I stepped off at my stop and walked past the darkened houses on my street, the anger had cooled into something quieter, something heavier. I unlocked my front door, hung my coat on the same hook I had used for years, and stood in my small living room listening to the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic. This house had never looked fancy, but every nail and board in it had a story. Most of those stories came from the years before Nathan was old enough to stand in a downtown restaurant and pull me back from walking out. Back then, I was working 12, 14 hours a day, driving my first truck myself, taking any load anyone would give me as long as it kept food on the table and the mortgage paid. When people ask how I got into logistics, they expect some clever answer about strategy or market gaps. The truth is simpler. I got into logistics because a friend of a friend said there was money in moving things people needed from one place to another, and I was willing to work harder than most. My late wife, Jenny, used to tease that I loved my truck more than my own bed. It wasn't true, but I did love the feeling of the engine under my feet and the road rolling out in front of me. I loved watching the sun come up in the mirror while Nathan and Maya slept at home in their small beds. On weekends, when I wasn't on a run, I'd take the kids down to the yard to wash the truck. Nathan, still small, would use a sponge almost the size of his head to scrub the wheels, and Maya would shout when she found any spot we missed. They didn't see the company then, of course. They just saw their dad's big metal beast and thought it was cool that he could make it roar. Years passed, and one truck became 2, then 5, then 10. I learned how to hire drivers, how to keep the books, how to negotiate with clients who tried to shave a little off the rate. Some nights I sat at this very kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me, tracing numbers with my finger because I didn't trust my tired eyes. Jenny would fall asleep on the couch with the TV on low, waiting for me to finally come sit beside her. I made mistakes, as everyone does when they build something from nothing, but slowly the company grew. When the time came, I took advice from a lawyer, Rob, who helped me set up a proper structure instead of just stuffing cash in envelopes and hoping for the best. We signed papers I did not fully understand at the time but trusted, and we created a trust with my name on it for the family's future. I kept working. Years later, when Nathan finished school and said he wanted to join the business, I felt a pride so strong it almost hurt. He started at the bottom, driving and doing night shifts in the warehouse, but he learned fast. Eventually, he moved into operations, handling schedules, clients, all the things that used to give me headaches. I began to step back a little, not because I was tired of working, but because I wanted him to feel the weight and the satisfaction of responsibility. Clients started calling him first. Staff went to him with questions. Slowly, people outside the company started to see Nathan as the face, while I stayed in the background, dealing with the deeper parts of ownership and long-term plans. I did not mind. I thought it was natural. When he first brought Lila to one of our Sunday barbecues at my bungalow, I could see why he was drawn to her. She was bright, chatty, full of ideas. She listened to our story about the early days and called it inspirational. She took photos of the yard and the grill and posted them, saying she loved humble beginnings. At the time, that sounded like a compliment. She helped clear plates, laughed at my old jokes about breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, and asked serious questions about the business. I thought, maybe naively, that she saw the value in what we had built. Over the next year, though, I started to notice small shifts. They were not explosions, just tiny cracks. Lila would make comments about the branding of the company, saying the logo looked old man and that the trucks needed a cooler vibe if we wanted younger clients. She would nudge Nathan about moving closer to downtown, away from my outdated, sleepy street. She never said it directly, but there was always a hint that my world was something they needed to grow out of. The first time I visited her parents' place for a dinner, I understood more clearly where that attitude came from. Their house was large and perfectly staged, with clean lines and art on the walls that looked like it belonged in magazines instead of homes. I arrived with a bottle of wine I had asked the store clerk to recommend, and Cynthia accepted it with a tight smile before placing it to the side and opening a different bottle from a cooler near the counter. Douglas showed me his home office with shelves of thick books and framed degrees. He spoke with ease about mergers and corporate litigation, and when I mentioned that I had built my company from a single truck, he smiled. He said it was a classic American story. Then he added that many old family businesses had trouble modernizing, and that sometimes fresh legal eyes were helpful when the next generation took over. I nodded, not wanting to start any arguments, and told him I was always happy for Nathan to get good advice. During dinner, conversations flowed around me. Cynthia talked about country clubs and charity events. Lila's friends and cousins shared stories about brand partnerships and luxury trips. When it came to my turn, someone asked what I did now that I was basically retired. I said I still kept an eye on things, that I was on the board, and that ownership was still in the family. Cynthia smiled and said she hoped Nathan would not let me stress too much about the old paperwork, because he needed to focus on the future. There was always that little push, the idea that my time was over, that I was a kind of mascot, useful for nostalgia but not for decisions. The trip to the bridal boutique made that feeling worse. Lila invited me along one afternoon with the explanation that she wanted my opinion on something classic for a father-son moment at the wedding. I took the bus again, walked into a room lined with white dresses, sparkling belts, and staff who looked like they had stepped out of a fashion ad. Lila stood on a small platform in front of a mirror, turning different ways while a woman pinned fabric and another hovered with a tablet. She really did look beautiful, and for a few minutes I simply watched, remembering how Jenny had looked in her own simple dress years ago, sewn by an aunt at the kitchen table. Then the conversation shifted. One of the staff asked politely about budget for the dress and the extra pieces. Before I could say anything, Lila laughed and said that we would keep the budget talk away from the old school numbers, and that I was more of a sentimental investor than a financial one. The staff chuckled softly, and one of them glanced at me, clearly uncertain whether to play along. Lila went on, telling them that I had built a cute old trucking thing and that Nathan had turned it into something real. She said it in a joking tone, as if she were just teasing, but I felt every word. I managed a small smile and said nothing because I did not want to embarrass my son or start a scene in front of strangers. That had become a pattern. I stayed quiet to keep the peace, and every time I did, something in me shrank a little. After that day at the boutique, I went down to the warehouse more often. Walking the floor grounded me. The smell of oil and cardboard, the sound of forklifts beeping and drivers calling to each other, the sight of packages moving in an organized flow. All of it reminded me that I was not just some old man who told truck stories. The people there still greeted me with respect. They asked about my health, told me about their kids, and thanked me for starting the company that now paid their bills. Brandon, one of Nathan's friends and colleagues, walked beside me one evening as we checked on a new loading dock. He said the younger drivers still told stories about how I once drove 16 hours through a snowstorm to deliver medicine to a hospital. I laughed and told him the truth, that it had been 12 hours and the snowstorm had been bad, but nothing heroic. He answered that it did not matter, that the point was I cared enough to show up. That simple sentence stuck with me. Someone still saw who I was, not just how I looked in a suit. Later, back at my bungalow, I sat at my small desk in the corner of the living room. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over a stack of files, an old computer, and a chipped mug full of pens. Against the wall stood a medium-sized cardboard box with a lid, taped neatly and labeled in my handwriting from years ago. The marker had faded a little, but the words were still clear. Company, ownership, and trust. On impulse, I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped to call Maya. She answered from her apartment, her face appearing on the screen with bookshelves behind her and a potted plant climbing up the wall. She wore glasses and had her hair pulled back, looking more like the financial analyst she was than the little girl who used to fall asleep in the truck's passenger seat on rare long trips. I told her about the engagement dinner, about the whispers and laughs, and the way Lila had looked right through me when she took the gift bag. I told her about the bridal boutique and the Hart's house, about Douglas's comments and Cynthia's glances. Maya listened quietly, her expression tightening as the stories piled up. When I mentioned that Nathan had stopped me in the restaurant hallway and talked about our turn, her face changed. She leaned closer to the camera and asked what he meant. I said I wasn't fully sure, but that he had pulled up a calendar reminder with Rob's name on it. She nodded slowly, saying that if Nathan was bringing Rob in, it meant he was serious. We talked a little more about feelings and family, about how easy it was for people like Lila to forget that someone who doesn't dress rich can still hold real power. At one point, Maya asked me to turn the phone so she could see more of the room. I thought she just wanted a glimpse of home, so I shifted my hand and let the camera take in the couch, the old TV, the small painting Jenny had loved, and then the corner where my desk and file box stood. She told me to stop and zoom in a little. I angled the phone until the label on the box came clearly into view. She read it aloud, slowly, then looked back at me through the screen. Her voice softened as she said I should keep that box close and not let anyone talk me into moving it or signing anything new until Rob had gone through it with me again. She reminded me that whatever jokes people cracked about truck stories or old watches, My name on those papers meant something that did not vanish just because someone with a nicer house decided I was an embarrassment. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at that simple handwritten label. The box had been in that corner for years, almost blending into the wall, part of the furniture. Now, after hearing my daughter's words and feeling my son's hand on my arm at the restaurant, I saw it differently. It was no longer just a box of old documents. It was the quiet center of a story most of the people at that engagement dinner had never bothered to ask about. A few days after the engagement dinner, when the glitter from that night had settled into a dull ache in my memory, Nathan called and asked if I could come over to Lila's parents' house for what he described as a planning session. He said they wanted to talk about wedding logistics and future structures, and that it would be good if I heard some of it directly. His voice sounded tired but steady, and I could tell he was trying not to say too much over the phone. I pulled on my coat, folded a scarf around my neck, and took the bus across town again, this time to the quiet, manicured street where the Hart House sat like a magazine ad. When I arrived, the front door was already open, warmth and soft music spilling out into the chilly air. Inside, the house smelled faintly of expensive candles and something baking. Cynthia greeted me with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, air-kissed my cheek, and told me they were just getting started in the living room. Douglas was already there, sitting in an armchair with a thin folder on his lap, glasses low on his nose. Leela and Nathan sat together on the couch, though Nathan's body leaned slightly away from her, shoulders tense. I took a seat on the edge of another chair, hands folded, ready to listen more than speak. Douglas opened the folder and said he had put together a simple, preliminary document for Nathan and Lila to consider, something he described as a standard prenup that would protect everyone. He spoke in smooth sentences, the kind that sound reasonable at first, even when you do not yet know what they really mean. He said that in cases where there was a family business, it made sense to clarify roles, future income, and how responsibilities would be divided between spouses. As he talked, he slid one copy of the document toward Nathan and one toward Lila. None was placed in front of me. I leaned forward a little, not to read every word, but to see the layout. Dense paragraphs, long lines, a few phrases in bold. Douglas explained that the document assumed the company and any future growth would be considered part of the couple's shared efforts, and that over time, decision-making would naturally move toward the active generation. He said that older arrangements were often sentimental, and that modern, clean structures were better for investors and public image. He did not say my name, but everyone in the room understood what older arrangements meant. Lila nodded and smiled, saying she liked the idea of fresh eyes on everything. Cynthia added that it would be good for Nathan to step out of his father's shadow, and finally run things the way his talent deserves. She glanced at me with a kind of polite pity, as if I were a child being gently told that his toy had been upgraded. I listened quietly, my hands resting on my knees, feeling the familiar urge to wave it off and tell myself they were only talking, not doing. Then Douglas said that if we could get general agreement in the room, he could have a cleaner draft ready for signatures soon. That word sat between us like a stone. I cleared my throat and asked as calmly as I could if the document mentioned the existing ownership and trust. Douglas smiled thinly and said those were legacy structures that could be harmonized later, once everyone agreed on the new framework. He added that with the right language, we could neutralize confusion around old titles. I understood enough to know that in his ideal version, the years I had spent building and protecting that company would be reduced to a warm story they told at parties, while the legal control shifted to the people in that room who wore better suits than mine. Before I could answer, Lila leaned forward and patted my knee lightly, like she was soothing a tired uncle. She said I shouldn't worry about the legalese, because Douglas and Nathan would take care of everything, and that I just needed to relax and enjoy retirement. Then, in a light tone, she added that every wedding had that one sweet mascot relative who worried about the old days, but that she wanted me to be able to just smile in photos and not fuss about boring paperwork. The word mascot scraped across my nerves more sharply than anything she had said at the restaurant. I saw Nathan's jaw clench, just for a second. He did not defend me yet, but his eyes flicked from her hand on my knee to my face and back. I lifted her hand gently away and said I had managed my share of paperwork in my life and that I would prefer to review anything with my own lawyer. The room went a little still at that. Douglas's smile thinned further. Cynthia's eyebrows rose. Lila laughed, but there was a tightness under the sound as she said, "Of course, if that made me feel better," and that she wanted transparency. On the surface, it was a harmless answer. Underneath, I could feel annoyance building like a quiet hum. The meeting moved on, but a line had been crossed. They were no longer just making jokes about my clothes or my stories. They were actively planning how to fold my life's work into their world, as if my consent were a small detail to resolve later. After an hour or two of talk about venues and guest lists, I excused myself, saying I needed to catch the bus before the schedule thinned for the night. Nathan walked me to the door. Outside, in the cold air near the driveway, he apologized in a low voice. He said he had not known his future father-in-law would bring documents that night, and that he did not like the way the conversation had gone. I told him I believed him, but that now we had clarity. Layla and her parents were not just casually unkind. They had a clear picture of what they wanted our family's future to look like, and it did not include me as anything more than a story and a signature. Nathan looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up, eyes darker than before. He said there were things he needed to show me, things he had seen on Lila's phone and social media, but that we should talk in private, not in front of her family. He asked if he could come by my house after work the next day. I said yes. The following evening, he arrived at my bungalow just after dark, shoulders hunched from the cold, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. I made us tea, the cheap kind I had always bought, and we sat at the small kitchen table that had held so many late-night calculations in the past. Nathan unlocked his phone, scrolled, and then pushed it across the table toward me. On the screen were screenshots of conversations between Lila and some of her friends. In one, she sent a photo from my backyard barbecue months ago and captioned it, "Love his humble beginnings, can't wait until the brand matches the lifestyle." In another, she wrote that she would make sure the embarrassing relative stays on the sweet side of the story at the wedding, and that if he did anything weird, she would spin it as adorable. My throat tightened as I read those words. There was another message where she told a friend that once the wedding was done and they had sorted the papers, she would help Nathan modernize everything, which she described as code for gently pushing his dad into retirement properly, paperwork and all. There were laughing emojis after that, as if pushing someone out of their life's work were a funny game. Nathan watched my face as I scrolled. He said he had not confronted her about those messages yet, that at first he wanted to believe they were just jokes, just the way she talked when she tried to impress her friends. But the more he heard from her parents, the more the pieces lined up. He admitted, voice low, that he had heard her on the phone telling a friend she was glad he was the face of the company now because it's easier to reshape a brand when the old founder is almost retired and just wants to feel included. That word included stung in a new way because it hinted at the role they saw for me, a man brought out and put away like a family heirloom. I sat quietly for a long moment, then slid the phone back to him and looked at the box in the corner of the room. I told Nathan that what hurt the most was not just how she saw me, but how little she understood what the company really was. It wasn't a brand to be reshaped for social media. It was the reason he and his sister had always had food, clothes, and a roof. It was the weight of promises made to employees who trusted us. Nathan nodded, eyes wet but jaw tight. He said he knew and that he was sorry he hadn't seen it sooner. He told me he never thought of me as a mascot or an embarrassment, and that hearing his future wife use those words made him feel sick. He said that when he grabbed my arm at the engagement dinner and told me tomorrow was our turn, he meant exactly this, that it was time we stopped letting other people write our story. The next morning, we met Rob at the company conference room. It felt strange, walking into that space with my son not as a boss and a junior, but as partners facing a common problem. Rob greeted us calmly, as always, shook our hands, and listened while we explained what had been said and what we had seen. We did not show him every screenshot, just enough to make the pattern clear, the jokes about my image, the plans about the company, the talk of sorting the papers. Rob took a few notes, then leaned back and reminded us, in simple words, that the ownership structure and trust we had put in place years ago were still valid. He explained that no one, not even a spouse, could simply talk those away at a dinner table. He suggested reviewing the existing documents and updating them where needed to reflect current realities and to add clear language about future spouses and control. He told us we didn't have to rush signatures, but he also gently pointed out that waiting too long could invite more pressure and confusion. His calm tone steadied me. I did not fully understand every term he used, but I understood this. There were tools on our side too, tools I had paid for years ago when I was still strong enough to work double shifts. They were still there, waiting in that labeled box and in Rob's files. We agreed to meet again after he had reviewed everything. Before we left, Rob said one more thing. He told Nathan that love did not require him to give anyone power over his father's work or his own future. He said that boundaries drawn with respect were still boundaries, and that it was better to set them before a wedding than to try to fix everything when it was too late. That evening, as the sun slid down behind the warehouse roofs, Nathan and I stood in the parking lot near the loading docks, the air sharp with cold and the smell of diesel. Trucks were already parked for the night, lined up like sleeping animals. The sky above us was dark blue, the first stars just starting to appear. We did not talk much at first. We just stood there, hands in pockets, watching our breath. Finally, I told him that I had spent my whole life letting other people think I was smaller than I was, because it was easier than arguing. I said that for the first time, I was tired of that. I wanted to be seen clearly, not for glory, but so that no one could rearrange my life while calling it help. Nathan nodded and said he understood. He said he felt the same, not about glory, but about respect. For me, for the company, for the years that had built this place. He said he was done laughing off Lila's comments as just her way. He would not let her parents turn our history into a prop. We agreed, there in the quiet lot, that we would handle this the way people like Douglas understood best, with facts, papers, and calm words in the right rooms, not with shouting at dinner tables. As we stood there, Nathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a voice note from Lila. He put it on speaker for a moment, and we heard her laughing with someone, saying that tomorrow night, at the next family gathering, she was going to get his dad to agree to something big while he's in a good mood, and that once the embarrassing relative signed what they needed, they could start making real moves. Nathan's thumb hovered over the pause button, and he stopped the recording mid-laugh. We looked at each other in the dim light. No raised voices, no drama, just a shared understanding that the line had not only been crossed, it had been erased completely. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, the sky outside still a dull gray. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the steam, thinking about that voice note. In it, Lila had sounded so casual, so sure that she could walk me toward a signature like you walk a child toward a birthday cake. I kept hearing that phrase, get his dad to agree to something big, and my hand tightened around the mug until my knuckles went white. But there was no shouting in my kitchen, no slammed doors, no broken plates. I had done that kind of anger when I was young and poor and scared. It never helped. Quietly, I set the cup down, stood up, and walked to the corner of the living room where the labeled box sat. I pulled it out from under the small table, brushed off the thin layer of dust, and set it on the coffee table. For a moment, I just looked at it, remembering the day Rob and I had finished putting everything inside. Back then, I thought it was something I might never need. Now, it felt like the only solid ground in a room where the floor kept shifting. I did not open it all the way. I lifted the lid just enough to see the edges of thick envelopes, clipped bundles of copies, and an old letter with my name typed across the top. I took a deep breath and put the lid back on. I knew what I had to do next. When the office opened, I called Rob and asked if he had time to meet with me and Nathan again, soon. He didn't sound surprised to hear my voice. He asked how bad it had gotten, and I told him in simple words, disrespect, pressure, jokes that were not really jokes, plans made without me. He said to bring the box and my son, and we would talk. That afternoon, Nathan and I met him in the company conference room. It was the same room where I had once signed a loan document that scared me half to death, the same room where we had celebrated paying that loan off years later. The walls were simple, the table was scratched from years of elbows and laptops, but to me, it felt more real than any polished living room at the Hart House. Rob laid out a legal pad and a pen, then gestured to the box. I pushed it toward him. He did not rush. He took his time, opening the lid, flipping through the folders, reminding me of when we had first created them. He spoke in clear language, not in the thick legal terms Douglas liked to use. He said we had done something smart years ago. We had built a structure that anchored the company and our family's future. The shares were still in my name. The trust still named my children as beneficiaries under certain conditions. There were rules already in place about how control could and could not be handed over. None of that disappeared because someone at a dinner table called me old-fashioned. As he spoke, I felt a strange mix of shame and relief. Shame that I had let myself forget how much we had already protected. Relief that it was not yet too late. Nathan asked questions too, not as a little boy asking his father, but as a grown man asking another grown man where he stood. Rob answered them all. Then, gently, he suggested we might want to update a few things to reflect our current situation. He said we could tighten certain clauses so that no spouse could ever claim control of the company or use marriage as a lever. We could be clear that any future distribution of wealth to Nathan or Maya would be under my control until I chose otherwise, and that none of it would automatically become joint property. He emphasized that this was not about punishing anyone. It was about clarity, about making sure the story of what we had built was not rewritten without our consent. I agreed. Nathan agreed. We did not sign anything that day, not in that room, but we gave Rob permission to review and prepare what needed to be reviewed and prepared. He said he would pull his own files, cross-check them, and call us back soon. Before we left, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. He reminded me that silence can be a form of power too, but only when it is chosen, not forced. He told me that waiting and gathering information was not weakness, it was strategy. I walked out of that room feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not fear, but steady. A few days later, Nathan and I sat in a small private area at the bank, the kind with soft chairs and a polished table. A man in a suit with a name tag greeted us and offered water. He spoke in that careful professional way, but as we explained what we wanted, to review existing accounts, trusts, and arrangements, his tone shifted from routine to respectful. He did not see the embarrassing relative. He saw an older man who had done the work of setting things up, and a son who wanted to understand it. We talked numbers and simple structures, nothing flashy. By the time we left, I knew two things clearly. First, my name still meant something in those systems. Second, if I chose to, I could shape the flow of what came after me without anyone's permission but my own and the law's. Back at the warehouse, life looked almost the same on the surface. Trucks still came and went, drivers still joked with each other, boxes still moved from one pallet to another. But under that normal rhythm, I felt a new current. Brandon caught up with me near the loading dock one evening, phone in hand. He said there was something he thought I should see. He had been added to a group chat created by Lila for the upcoming engagement brunch, a mix of friends, co-workers, and a few potential business partners she wanted to impress. In that chat, she had posted photos of the country club hall they had booked, captioning them with phrases about two powerful families joining forces and introducing the upgraded Cole brand. In one message, she joked about making sure the aesthetic of the wedding matched her lifestyle content. In another, she wrote that she hoped the older generation would stay on script and not say anything off-brand. Brandon rolled his eyes as he showed me, saying it was all so shallow it practically squeaked, but he also pointed out something else. The last line of one of her messages said she was meeting with Dad to go over contract talking points before the brunch. I had never heard anyone talk about my life's work with that much arrogance in so few words. I thanked him for showing me and told him to keep his focus on his job, not on family drama. He laughed and said he was not worried. He just did not want to see his friend Nathan get boxed into something he didn't choose. That night, when I got home, I called Maya again. She answered with a notebook and pen already in hand. I told her what Rob had said, what the banker had confirmed, what we had seen in Lila's messages. Instead of panicking, she went practical, as she always did. She suggested we build a simple list of what existed in my name, what lived in the trust, and what would be up for discussion in the future. She shared her screen and started typing. Company shares, property, savings, pensions. It was not about exact amounts. It was about shape. She drew little arrows showing how things could move, but only if I chose. She talked me through different ways to support Nathan and any future grandchildren without handing the keys of the whole operation to someone who saw me as a prop. Hearing her voice, steady and clear, made the noise of Lila's laughter and Douglas's smooth speeches fade for a while. We agreed again that we would not show Lila or her parents any documents. We would not threaten or brag. We would prepare, update what needed updating, and then wait. Toward the end of the call, she asked if there were any upcoming events where both families would be present. I started to say just the usual dinners, then remembered the chat Brandon had shown me. I opened my own phone, and there it was, a new notification from a group called Engagement Brunch, Families Plus Partners, that I had ignored earlier because my head was full. I tapped it open. At the top of the chat, a message from Lila invited everyone to a special brunch at the country club to celebrate our union and future joint ventures. She wrote that both families would be there, along with a few important people connected to the business side. She promised speeches, photos, and some exciting news about modernizing the Cole name. There were already little heart and champagne emojis under her words. I read the message aloud to Maya. She went quiet for a moment, then said slowly that this sounded like the stage they had been building toward from the first fancy dinner. A room where image mattered, where they could talk about my company as if it were some shiny new project without mentioning the years of sweat that had built it. She asked what I wanted to do. I did not answer right away. I looked around my living room, the worn couch, the small TV, the box on the table, the faded photos of Jenny, Nathan, and Maya on the wall. Then I looked back at my phone screen, at the words, important people connected to the business side. I told her I had spent many years standing in the back of rooms so others could shine. I said I had thought I was fine staying there until I saw how easily some people tried to write me out completely. Then I told her I would go to that brunch, I would sit where they put me, I would listen to their speeches about brands and lifestyles. But this time, if they tried to use my name and story as decoration for their own plans, I would not stay silent. Maya nodded, eyes bright. She said she had a feeling that this brunch, for all its white tablecloths and careful lighting, would be the place where everyone finally saw who was really central and who was just pretending. We ended the call, and I set the phone down on the table. A few seconds later, it buzzed again, this time with a notification from the same group chat. A pinned message confirming the date and time of the country club brunch with a glossy photo of the hall attached. I stared at the image of long tables, shining plates, and a small stage with a microphone in front. For the first time, instead of feeling dread, I felt something else, a calm sense that the next move would not belong only to them. The week before the brunch, the air in the city turned even colder, the kind of cold that makes you pull your coat tighter and walk a little faster, just to feel like you are moving towards something that matters. Each day, I woke up earlier than I needed to, sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and looked at the calendar on the wall. The brunch date was circled, not in red like some movie scene, but in my usual blue pen. Still, that circle felt different from all the others. It was not just a family event. It was the day when everyone's stories about who I was and what the company meant would collide in one room. Nathan came by the house 2 nights after we got the invitation. He was still in his work clothes, tie loosened, shirt wrinkled at the sleeves. He sat on the couch, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and stared at the box on the coffee table like it was a third person in the room. He said Rob had gone through most of the documents and that things looked solid. He said it with a kind of quiet satisfaction, like a man who has checked a bridge before driving over it. I asked him if he was ready for what might happen if Lila and her parents realized their plans would not go the way they imagined. He took a deep breath and said that was exactly why he wanted to deal with this now, before vows and signatures and shared mortgages made everything even more tangled. We did not talk about love much. That might sound strange given the subject, but it was the truth. Nathan understood that he still cared for Lila. He did not try to deny it, but he also understood that love without respect is just a pretty word pasted over something sharp. He said he would rather face the sharp edges now than pretend everything was smooth and cut himself later. A day before the brunch, Maya came over too. It felt almost like the old days when the kids were younger, except now they were adults with jobs, responsibilities, and voices that carried the weight of their own experiences. She spread papers on the table, not legal documents, just her own notes. She had drawn a simple map of our situation with circles and arrows. Me, the company, the trust, Nathan, her, any future grandchildren. She showed us how things could stay strong and clear even if the family expanded. Then she drew another path, the one that might happen if we let other people's ambitions write the rules for us. In that path, my name faded into the background, and all the arrows flowed through other hands. We all looked at that second sketch, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Nathan reached out and drew a bold line through that second path with his pen, the ink dark and final. He said he was done letting other people use me as a prop for their success stories. Later that evening, after they both left, I stood alone in the living room, the house quiet again. I walked over to the old mirror above the small side table, the one Jenny used to check her hair in before we went out. My reflection stared back. Older, lines deeper, shoulders still straight. I tried to see myself the way Lila and her friends saw me. Embarrassing relative, old man with a tragic watch, mascot for a story they wanted to upgrade. Then I looked closer and tried to see myself the way my children saw me. The man who had once driven all night in bad weather to make sure a shipment reached a hospital, the man who had taught them how to ride bikes and balance checkbooks, the man who had tried, in his own imperfect way, to give them something solid to stand on. The second view felt truer. I turned away from the mirror and went back to the coffee table. The box was still there, closed now, but somehow more present than it had ever been when it sat quietly in the corner. I rested my hand on the lid, feeling the cardboard under my palm, and said out loud, in a low voice, that I would not let anyone take what this box represented and turn it into a piece of decoration in their brand story. Saying it out loud made it real. The morning of the brunch, the sky was bright and cold, sunlight bouncing off patches of frost on the sidewalks. I dressed slowly, choosing the same good shirt I had worn to the engagement dinner, but this time I paired it with a newer jacket Nathan had helped me pick out a few weeks back. It was simple, dark, well-fitted. I checked my watch, the tragic old man watch, as Lila's friend had called it, and decided it would stay on my wrist. It had been there through every important moment of my life. It deserved to be there for this one too. Before I left the house, I picked up a small envelope that Rob had given me after our last meeting. He had described it as something to keep with you, not to wave around, but to remember where I stood if conversations got confusing. I did not open it. I just slid it into my inner jacket pocket and patted it once, like a quiet promise to myself. At the country club entrance, everything looked polished and rehearsed. A staff member in a suit opened the door and greeted me by name, clearly briefed in advance. Inside, the hall looked almost exactly like the photo in the group chat. Long tables draped in white cloth, glasses glinting under soft lights, a small stage at the front with a microphone and a screen set up for some kind of presentation. People were already milling around, glasses of orange juice and champagne in hand, cheeks flushed with early morning excitement. I saw Lila near the front of the room, dressed in a pale blue outfit that matched the flowers on the tables. She was laughing with a small cluster of people, pointing toward the stage as if describing where something dramatic would happen later. Her parents stood nearby, Cynthia in a fitted dress and Douglas in a dark suit, talking to a group of men I recognized from business news and industry events. They were potential partners, clients, or maybe investors. I had never seen them in my warehouse, but I had seen their names in articles. For a moment, I simply watched. It struck me that this room, with its white cloth and polished glasses, was not so different from my warehouse. Both were spaces for moving something from one place to another. In the warehouse, we moved goods. Here, they wanted to move stories and power. Nathan spotted me near the doorway and came over, his expression a little tight but calm. He hugged me briefly and said I looked good. I told him the same. He glanced around the room, then lowered his voice and said that everything was ready on his side. He did not go into detail, and I did not ask. We had agreed not to talk about specific moves in crowded spaces. We would stay on the same page because we had been writing it together, not because we rehearsed lines like actors. Cynthia approached with a bright smile and announced that they were so pleased I could be there to share this special moment. Douglas added that it would be a new chapter for both families and the company story. Lila joined them, wrapping one arm around Nathan's and giving me a warm, practiced smile. She thanked everyone nearby for coming, then said loudly enough for several people to hear that she couldn't wait for them to see what we've been working on. She glanced toward the stage when she said it, and so did many of the guests. Whatever she thought this morning would be, she clearly imagined it as a moment where she and her family would stand in front of that microphone and present a polished version of my world. I took a seat at one of the tables near the front, not in the very first row, but close enough to see everything clearly. Maya arrived shortly after, in a simple dress with her hair pulled back, looking every inch the professional she was. She came over to hug me, then went to sit at the same table as Brandon and a few longtime employees who had been invited as part of the family business image. Their presence grounded me. These were people who remembered the early days. They were not impressed by chandeliers. They were impressed by paychecks clearing on time and trucks arriving when they were supposed to. As people settled into their seats, soft music played. Waiters moved between tables with trays of pastries and fruit. Lila walked around greeting guests, each smile and laugh as composed as a photo. At one point, she stopped near my table and leaned down slightly, putting a hand on my shoulder. She thanked me again for coming and said in a low voice that she hoped I would like the direction they were about to present, because it would be great for the company's image. I looked up at her and answered that I always appreciated seeing people's true direction. She seemed to take that as approval and moved on. The hum of conversation grew, then shifted as someone tapped a glass with a spoon near the front. The sound rang out lightly over the murmur of voices. Douglas stepped toward the small stage, holding his own glass, and smiled at the crowd. He said it was time to begin, that they had some exciting things to share about the future of this family and its business legacy. As he spoke, I felt Nathan slide into the seat beside me for a moment, his knee bumping against mine under the table. He did not look at me, but his hand brushed my sleeve in a small, steadying gesture. Across the room, a few guests raised their phones, ready to record whatever announcement was about to unfold. The soft clink of glass, the shift of chairs, the faint click of camera apps opening on screens, all of it blended into one clear signal in my mind. The stage they had built for their story was finally lit, and whether they knew it or not, they had also lit the stage for ours. Douglas started his speech with practiced warmth, talking about legacy and brands and how lucky our families were to be joining forces. He spoke about Nathan's drive and Lila's vision about taking an old logistics story and turning it into a modern platform. At one point, he even gestured in my direction, calling me the heart of our narrative, like I was a chapter heading in a book he had written. When he mentioned aligning ownership and image, Nathan stood up. The motion was calm but firm enough that several phones swung toward him. He asked his mother's side of the room to give him a moment and then turned to Lila's. He said he loved her, that no one doubted her talent, but that love did not give anyone the right to erase the man who built the foundation they were all standing on. The room went quiet. He told everyone that the company was not an old brand to be reworked, but a business protected by a trust and documents that still sat in my name. Then he said that before any talk of joint ventures or modernizing, he and I had met with our lawyer and the bank to ensure that control and ownership would not be shifted by marriage, pressure, or image. A few guests gasped when he mentioned the word trust. Lila's smile cracked for the first time. Douglas started to step forward, but Nathan held up a hand and said he would not be signing any document that tried to push me aside, and he would not marry anyone who spoke about his father as an embarrassment while planning to profit from his work. I reached into my jacket, touched the envelope, and stayed seated. I did not need to wave it. The point had already landed. Phones kept recording as silence spread through the hall, and for once, every eye on me did not see a mascot. They saw the man whose quiet name on old papers had just stopped the show.